Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Emotion at Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And this episode is a pausing for breath and a reflective episode. So over the course of the last 6 months, I've produced 12 episodes where I've interviewed different practitioners, researchers, or those that are interested in the fields of emotion, credibility and deception in the workplace, where we've explored a whole host of different themes, and I'll come back to those as we go. On average though, we've had a podcast out every 2 weeks, and bearing in mind our podcasts are quite long form, so I think the shortest I've managed is a 40-minute one, and the longest, or episode 12, has been an hour and 40, which I think is our longest by far. So we've done a lot of stuff and we've covered a lot of ground, and I guess I wanted to take some time to just pause and reflect on all of that stuff, on all of those things, all of those episodes, but also kind of how the experience has been for me over the course of that period of time as well. So also the keen-eared listener will know that over the last few episodes, I think I started mentioning it in episode 9, which is the neuroscience one, I've been struggling with some health stuff. And that's to do with an injury I sustained at Christmas last year. And to fix said injury needs me taking a substantial amount of time off work. So I'm going to be taking a couple of months off and a couple of months away. And I worked hard to make sure that while I'm away, the podcast series continues. So when you're listening to this, I'll have already been off for a number of weeks, and I've still got some weeks to go. So what you'll hear over the next, I think 3 episodes of the Emotion at Work podcast will be a rebroadcast. So I'm going to rebroadcast some of my favourite episodes that we've covered so far. And I'm going to focus on the earlier editions, the earlier episodes from the podcast, because what I've seen is the amount of people engaging with the podcast has increased massively over the last, say, 2 months. Over the last 8 weeks, I've gone from I've nearly doubled in the kind of daily downloads of the podcast. So I want to make sure that the earlier episodes, which have got some absolute corkers in there, that they're getting some really quality airtime as well. So we're going to rebroadcast some of the original, some of the earlier episodes, but also I'm going to add some reflection from me today. So between when you're listening to this, which will be on the 16th of November or thereabouts, so between now and the end of the year, we'll be rebroadcasting some of the early episodes, and then I'm hoping to come back in early 2018, and I'll let you know later on in this episode who we've got lined up for next year. We've got some really, really great guests lined up to start us off next year, which is really good too. So I was looking back over the series of podcasts that we've done so far, and I've loved every second of the conversations that I've had, and I think that's part of the reason that I'm still going, that I have thoroughly enjoyed and loved actually every podcast interview I've done so far. The learning I've had from the guests that we've had on, from the conversations that have taken place, and then the impact on my own personal practice has been noticeable. And I thought it might be helpful to go back and look back through that really. So if I take us all the way back to episode 2, so even though it's called episode 2, this was the first proper episode. So episode 1 was me sort of setting the context as to why I want to do the podcast, and all of the reasons I said in that first episode still hold true. But if I think about episode 2, this was where I had a long chat with Sarah Jane Lenny, and we talked about her role as a detective inspector at Greater Manchester Police, and then the emotion rules that govern the regulation and the expression of emotion in that setting, in that law enforcement environment. And she talked about how the credible emotion is anger. So any other emotion isn't credible. So fear isn't credible, as an example. Anger is the dominantly credible emotion, and that got me really thinking about what is the dominant emotion or the dominant credible emotion in other workplaces that I engage with. So that could be other workplaces that I engage with as a customer. So when I go into stores, or when I go into offices, or when I go into places, what seems to be like the dominant credible way to go about your work? And I find that it really varies. and there are some where it appears to be one thing, but I think it's actually another. And there are times where it appears to be one thing and it is another. And there's one workplace in particular where the common narrative is around positivity and about the importance of focusing on the customer and the customer experience. But actually what I see, or what I experience, sorry, I should say, not necessarily just see, because it comes across in other senses as well, but what I experience is the almost relentlessness of that focus creates a environment of a mixture, really, of fear and suppression. So because if I pick up lots of signals of fear around if the customer isn't having a good experience, or if customer isn't having an amazing experience, that I as an individual who might be interacting with that customer is going to be disciplined or chastised or challenged or told off because of that, because the customer isn't having that experience. And for me, I find that a really interesting way that an organisation where it is wholly appropriate and accurate to put the customer at the heart of what they do actually has created a culture of incessant pressure and fear. And my experience of interacting with the senior leaders within that organisation is that they have very little or no awareness that is the case. And I find that really hard to work with. So I find it really hard to work with as someone who, so this isn't a client of mine, this is an organisation that I know well, but isn't a client of mine. So I don't have a role in trying to make it better. So it's not that they've brought me in to say, Phil, can you help make this better? And I'm finding it really hard to work with as an individual who kind of knows this stuff, because I can see it, I can hear it, I can feel it when I'm in the organisation, but it's not my place to do anything about that. And I'm really struggling with it, because I can see the fear and the anxiety and the trepidation that is just prevalent within the people that interact with customers, but I have no role in doing anything with or about that. And I find that really hard. And it takes me back to this episode with S.J. Lenny, where we talked about the importance of deep acting, as a researcher would call it, where people have to suppress the emotions that they're experiencing to such an extent that they then have to create and act in a way that is very different to how they're feeling, and then the burnout that goes with that. I mean, I find it exhausting, and I don't even work there. So how it must be for people that work there is just amazing, and I really worry about the kind of future health and well-being for the people that work in that environment. And it's got me thinking, how do I help, and what can I do to help? And I haven't got the answers to those questions yet, but something that I'm working with. And I guess that acting then is I'm using it as a segue into episode 3. So episode 3 was the special edition from the CIPD's L&D show that took place in London in May this year. And here I interviewed Peter Cheese, the chief exec of the CIPD, and had a really interesting kind of 3-way conversation with Barbara Thompson and Joe Cook. And one of the things that sort of still sticks with me from this interaction is the conversation with Joe and Barbara, where we talked about the different personas that people may have. So we talked about the different personas that people can have online. I remember Barbara talking about, Barbara on Twitter is @CaribThompson. And I remember her talking about how she has different social media channels for like different versions of her. So she has different versions of Barbara that she puts out to the world in different ways across different social media channels. And I remember being fascinated with this at the time, but I guess my interest in it has gone even further now, where I'm starting to think even more about what different social media channels do I use for what purpose. So interestingly, as an example, this podcast is the only channel on which I've spoken about my health stuff in a public way. So I haven't put anything on Facebook, I haven't put anything on Twitter, I haven't put anything on Instagram about it. And it's interesting that I reflect on, well, why is that then? And I think it's because of the personal kind of connection that I have with both you as my listeners and my audience, but also with the guests that I get on the podcast as well. So because it is a more personal interaction and a more depth of detail of conversation that I'm having with these individuals, and I don't think it's strategic, but it might be, that kind of sharing of more personal information, especially at the start of the podcast, which is where I tend to do it. I wonder if I'm doing that at some level to get more sharing back from the person that I'm interacting with. So I don't like kind of glossing over the how are you question. So if you've listened to a number of the episodes, you'll know that, you know, I talk about the how are you question as a social lubricant. And Jessica Robles in episode 10, I think, talked about Harvey Sachs' work in terms of the paper Everybody Must Lie in response to the how are you question. And I don't like doing that. So when somebody asks me at the start of the podcast, how are you doing? Well, then I'll share, you know, I don't want to share everything, because even in this episode, I haven't told you what's really going on and what's wrong. I've just told you that I'm unwell. But I find it interesting when I reflect on why have I chosen this media to share that information, where I've not shared it elsewhere. So that interplay of what parts of or what aspects of myself do I share across different social media platforms and channels, and why, is a really interesting one for me to think about. And I've been more discerning with what I share, where I share it, and how I share it. I've been much more thoughtful about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and where all that sort of stuff is coming from, as a result of the conversation that Barbara Joe and I had at the L&D show in May. That brings us on to episode 4, where I had the wonderful opportunity to chat with Ben Fletcher. So he's at Arrowmaker76 on Twitter, and we talked about the role of purpose and meaning in the workplace. And I'll be honest, I can talk to Ben forever, really. I'd love to hear him talk about his passion for purpose and his drive for wanting people to have genuine meaning in their work. And I'm incredibly proud of the work that we did at Boots Opticians together. And I've taken that on both in my personal life in terms of my own personal purpose, but I've also taken that on to really start to play with this notion of purpose with other clients as well, both on an individual perspective and at an organisational level as well. So helping individuals think about their personal purpose and what does what do they stand for, and what are their values, what are their beliefs, and those sorts of things. And I find it a hugely rewarding thing to do. And I'm yet to have somebody tell me that it's a process that they see little value in. So whether that be, so I'm working with a group of individuals at the moment on a talent program, and we've spent kind of over social tools, so using Slack as a channel. We've already started the discussion about, that's a lie. We started it in a face-to-face discussion, and then we've continued it over Slack, exploring, what is someone's purpose, why, what is their why, what's their reason for being. I'm also I am 2/3 of the way through Grit, which is a book by Angela Duckworth, where she talks about the importance of passion and perseverance, and playing with all of those notions. I find a hugely rewarding thing, both for me personally, but also for working with other people on. And it's often taking individuals into a way of thinking that they've not experienced before. And I really enjoy that. And I enjoy seeing other people grappling with what are tricky and difficult and challenging questions, but once grappled with, what individuals share is the hugely beneficial results of grappling with those things. So it's very much a thing that I want to continue and build on. So then we go on to episode 5, where I talked with a friend of mine, Georgie Nightingale, and again, the keen listener or the long-time listener will know that her practice of changing up conversation by asking different questions and moving on from the transactional "so what do you do?" question has been hugely beneficial. And again, what I've started to do is to take some of the questions that she shared with me both in that podcast and afterwards and take them out to use in bigger, broader life. So I'm really enjoying changing up the types of interactions that I have with people in coffee shops. I know that that's something that Georgie talks about as well, but just changing that interaction from, can I have a white tea and this sandwich please, or a white tea and a porridge with honey and banana please. And just changing up that transactional ritual conversation to be something different. And I'm finding I get a lot more richness and joy from my day. I get to know people a little bit better. I get to build a more interesting kind of connection and discussion with other people. And I find it really, really enjoyable. And so taking those questions both into my personal life and into my professional life, I find to be really, really useful. So I hope the questions that she shared both in that podcast and also that I've used since, I hope they're helpful for you. Then we go to episode 6. So we went in quite a different direction. So this was our first kind of foray down the deception and forensics route, where Dr. Sam Larner from Manchester Met Uni came along and talked to us about forensic linguistics and how forensic linguistics can help us in what we do. And the bit that really stuck for me in that is the use of formulaic language. So Sam introduced us to this term formulaic language, where we look at language from a chunks point of view. So rather than thinking about creating individual words, we combine words together to create chunks of words. And where I get really interested then is listening for that formulaic language with the clients that I interact with. And what are the phrases or the sayings that appear to be formulaic? So what are the sort of stock phrases? But then I've taken it on a level to go, well, what does that mean then? Or what does that, no, that's not true actually. It's not what does that mean. It's what does that tell me, or what can that tell me about this organisation? So if I think about one of my clients that I'm working with at the moment, they say the customer is everything, and that's a formulaic phrase that gets trotted out on a regular basis. So in meetings and discussions, you'll hear, or I will hear, not you will, because you're not in the meetings, but I will hear the phrase "the customer is everything." And I find that fascinating, because whilst there are other values within that organisation that talks about colleagues and employees, those other values don't get, those other formulaic phrases that are there within the organisation don't get talked about anywhere near as much as "the customer is everything." So that tells me where the focus really is. So even though there are other values that talk about colleagues and employees, actually the way that those formulaic phrases are used and the frequency at which they're used indicates to me that the customer is paramount in everything that organisation does. Now, for me, that's not a bad thing. That's just a thing. And what that also tells me, though, was it gives me potential indicators of where I need to frame my work. So the work that I'm doing with that client, how I need to frame it so it's going to have the most resonance with the client, but also it tells me where the focus and the attention is within the organisation. So the focus and the attention will be on it appears as though it will be on the customer over the colleague or the employee. So it's something that I'm continuing to observe to see, well, how does that play out then in interaction, but also in performance and in the way that performance is managed and communicated. So that's one I'm continuing to watch that was triggered by Sam. And I'm linking that into episode 7 then, where I talked with Kirsha Denegara and Claire Genkai-Breeze. We talked about a few things. We talked about vulnerability. We talked about being flawed but willing. But one of the bits that I guess really stuck out for me was this idea of a near enemy. So when I then think back to my previous example of the customer is everything, what's the near enemy of that? So the near enemy of that for me is we become blind to everything else. So it's all very well having a focus on the customer, but the near enemy of that is becoming blind to anything else. So we then become blind to other issues or other people or other situations or other things that aren't the customer. And if we become blind to that, what does that mean about the way that we interact with other people? So for me, they're really interesting things about how does the formulaic language and what could that indicate for me about the culture, and then what's a near enemy of that? Because having a really strong customer focus can be a massively beneficial thing for an organisation. At the same time, the near enemy of that is we ignore everything else at the expense of the customer. And that for me is an interesting kind of quandary to go into. Episode 8 was about listener questions. So I had questions from a few different people, from Annette, from Annette Hill, Ross Garner, Patrick Malarkey and Sarah Taylor. And it's Sarah Taylor's one that sticks out with me, and she's one of the guests that we've got to come in the future. And I've been pondering a lot on the balance between self-acceptance and self-improvement was her question. And I gave my response at the time, but it's something that I've continued to think about in terms of accepting myself and what I am, who I am, what I do, how I do it. And how does that, because I have a real strong reflective practice aspect to me. So I don't journal in a traditional sense. I audio journal, I do audio recordings of my reflections and I listen back to them. And that gives me cues and clues around sort of self-improvement things that I want to do. But I also know that I can be really harsh on myself. I can be really hard on myself in terms of things that I've done, ways that I've done it, how I've gone about it, things that I've achieved or succeeded or not at. And I'm wondering, at what point do I need to just accept myself as I am? And to what extent do I need to continue to improve? And it's an ongoing thing that I'm grappling with. So one of the things that I've decided to accept is that I ask lots of questions, and can I ask better questions? And episode 11 of the podcast was about clean language, and that got me interested in a different type of questions and questions to ask. But I'm accepting that my ability to craft a question is already high. And sometimes that question may or may not need crafting, and my awareness of when it does and doesn't need crafting is high. So I'm okay with that as an area that I've been practicing and working on a lot over a number of years, and I'm going to accept that that's okay now. And there are other things that I want to continue to work on. So yeah, it's been a really interesting one to decide, what am I going to accept that I'm good at? So do I think I'm the best questioner in the world ever? No. Do I think there are still things that I could learn about questioning? Yes. But is that something that I want to continue to actively pursue at this moment in time? No. Will I come back to it later in the future? Maybe. I don't know. But for now, I'm accepting that is where it is. Episode 9 then was Emotion at Work in Neuroscience, where I had a really fab chat with Matt Wall, where we talked about myths, misconceptions and issues of methodology when it comes to neuroscience. And the thing that really sticks with me from Matt's, the thing that continues to stick with me from the discussion with Matt is, does it matter if people don't know, and I say people, does it matter if the wider population don't know what's happening in the brain when something happens? So we were talking about happiness and the different chemical releases that go with that. Does it matter if people don't know that and they just know that? So we can ask people if they're happy. Does it matter if we know or measure what's happening within them when they do it, if they report that they're happy? And part of me says yes and part of me says no, because people lie. So somebody might self-report as being happy, but there could be different contextual and societal pressures that are influencing that self-reporting as happy. So would it be beneficial to quantify or qualify that with other data and other stimulus? You know what, maybe it would, but is it worth it, is the bit that I keep coming back to. So whilst it may be useful and interesting to get that wider data to challenge or support it, does it matter? So when people walk out of a shop where they've got, or through an airport where they've got those rating things where you have to hit a face that is like angry, sad, okay, a bit happy, really big wide smiling emoji, are the airports also, or the stores also reviewing the CCTV footage to find out if there were genuine smiles depicted during the course of that visit to the store that supports or reinforces the rating that they gave as they left? Or do they just take the rating as it is, accepting the fact that children will press buttons that don't necessarily correlate, that teenagers might go in and press the sad button loads and loads and loads of times because it's funny, that they just accept that those things will happen, and they've got ways and means of aggregating it without getting all the other stuff that sits behind it. So it's an ongoing one, I think, for me to work and debate with, because my initial thinking is we don't need to know what's going. It might be interesting for me as a emotion, credibility and deception practitioner and researcher. So it might be really useful for me to know what's going on behind the scenes. But does everybody else need to know that? And I guess that's the challenge. And it's a challenge for me in the design work that I do for the learning that I organise both digitally and face to face. So I can analyse interaction down to a really specific turn-taking aspect. But does everybody else need to know that level or that depth of knowledge? Or can they just ask me to come in and help them where they need to? It's an interesting one to think about. Thinking about interaction then, that takes us on to episode 10, where I talked with Dr. Jessica Robles about emotion at work and everyday talk. And I loved this conversation. It was great fun, talking about the different things that happen in interaction and the way that the individuals speak with each other. And the one thing that I've been thinking about more and more was something we talked about right at the end of the podcast, which was about children and crying. So nothing really to do with my work at all, at least not directly. Thinking about, do children leave gaps in speech do children leave gaps in crying for adults or carers to come in and support them? And I've been looking at it in my 4-year-old, because he's the one that cries the most, and he definitely does. But I think a lot of his crying is strategic crying as opposed to genuine. So when I'm more interested in when he's injured himself and those cries than I am with his cries of disappointment that he's not getting sweets today or something equivalent to that. And what I'm noticing in those cries where he has injured himself is initially there will be a number of kind of wails while he's busy assessing the wound that he's got on his knee or his arm or wherever it might be. But then he will leave spaces for me to kind of come in and interject. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how her research progresses. Episode 11 then was about clean language, and I'm clean out because this is quite recent for me. So this recording was in October, and we're now mid-November. So there's more work for me to do in reading around the questions that she talked about. My guest Judy Rees, I say she. So the questions that Judy talked about from David Grove's work, where his studies began. So I need to do more reading around it. And the bit that still sticks with me from this episode is the pressure I felt in the initial kind of stages to do something in response to the questions that were being asked. I felt like I was being asked to orientate something somewhere. I really didn't want to do it. And I had a conversation on Twitter with somebody afterwards where we were pondering. So I pushed back and refused to answer the question, and I refused to situate something physically, my physiology refused to situate it. And we were discussing around, is that something that others would do, or would they accept, or would that pressure of wanting to answer the question be too much, and they would give a response that might not necessarily be accurate or true. They're just giving a response because of that. And it's got me thinking about the types of questions that I ask in the coaching sessions and in the consultation work that I do. How much pressure am I putting on those people that I'm asking questions of in the interactions that I have, and to what extent are they then complying because they feel they need to comply as opposed to giving a genuine response? And there was a facilitation event I was doing recently where I had 5 questions that sort of built their way up in degrees of personalness, I guess. So question 1 was one you'll have heard me use before: what have you craved this week? And then that worked all the way up to question 5, where I stole a bit of World Blue language and said, what would you do with your career if you weren't afraid? And bearing in mind all of these people worked in the same organisation, nobody had, in their response to that question, nobody had working in that organisation as part of it anymore. So all of them had left the organisation they were currently working in and gone on to do something different. And my reflections afterwards were on the question. So the question of what would you do with your career if you weren't afraid? So part of it is to do with the meaning that we take. So we talked about meaning before in terms of how people can interpret things, and people can interpret one question or one statement or one action in 2 very different ways. So was that interpreted as a complete freedom question? If I was able to do anything, with money no object and time no object and no other practical reality issues in the way, what would I do? I would do this. And we had some real amazing responses. But was it a stretch too far? I guess is my thought, is my question. Was it a step too far? So it is in terms of, was it too abstract? So were the responses genuine, that these are things that people actually really seriously want to do, or was this pipe dream type stuff? So one for me to think about in terms of where do I go with that or a similar question in the future. And then finally, episode 12, talking with Professor Dawn Archer, which, the longest podcast to date, hour and 40 minutes, was just a joy to behold. And there's so much in there that I have and will continue to reflect on. But it was only recorded recently. It was only recorded about a week or so ago from where I am now, so I haven't done lots of processing with it. So I'm going to leave episode 12 there, and one I'll come back to at a future date or time. And then when I pause and think, if I do the meta thing, because I tend to do meta stuff, as you will know by now, there's a lot of my own personal reflections in that, just across those 12 episodes or 11 episodes that have come so far. So I hope you've had similar occasions to reflect, and that it's giving you the content that you've heard as we worked our way through the last 6 months have also given you calls for thought and opportunities to pause and reflect. So I hope me sharing some of my reflections has been both helpful and useful for you as well. I want to do like a pause and a movie edit into still to come on the Emotion at Work podcast. So guests lined up then. So I mentioned one earlier, Sarah Taylor. We've got an interview lined up with her. Also Professor Carrie Cooper, who's the president of the CIPD. He and I are talking about mental health. Also talking to an emotion and memory researcher. We're trying to get a date in the diary lined up so we can talk about the role between emotion and memory and learning. Because I think they're interesting distinctions to give. So some really interesting and exciting guests still to come. So to pull this episode together then, I just want to say thanks for listening. Thank you if you'll subscribe on iTunes or Podbean or Overcast or wherever you get your podcast from. Thank you so much for listening to the Emotion at Work podcast. I thoroughly enjoy producing these podcasts, and they're just hugely beneficial for me to do. If you have time and the inclination, I would love you to give me a review on iTunes if you're an Apple subscriber, or review me wherever you get your podcast from. I'd be very grateful, and it's always good to hear what you guys think of the content that we're putting out there out to the big wide world. So thanks for listening. Enjoy the rebroadcasts that come over the next few weeks, and unless you hear from me before, have a wonderful Christmas, have a fantastic New Year, and I will see you for the next new episodes in 2018. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox, edited together by Simon Leverton. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @PhilWilcox. Thanks for listening.